Days after this bridge collapsed, the search for survivors is continuing. Dozens of people were killed when an 80-metre section of the Morandi Bridge in the northern Italian city of Genoa collapsed in heavy rain.
The operations continued all night long. We are demolishing the bigger chunks of rubble and will continue until we find everyone listed as missing.
Authorities don't yet know how it came down, but the Italian government blames the bridge's private owner, Atlantia Spa, and is calling for resignations.
The collapse is inextricably linked to the fact that every time we pay for highways, we think it'll be used for both routine and unconventional maintenance of roads and bridges. But the operators are spending the money elsewhere, which caused the collapse.
The government is now looking to revoke Atlantia Spa's road toll concession, causing its stock to slump as much as 27% on Thursday, losing $6.8 billion. Meanwhile, Italy's other Deputy Prime Minister has blamed the collapse on EU budget constraints.
Many motorways need maintenance, but often we are told we cannot spend money because of European constraints, limits, deficits, the GDP, debt.
The EU was quick to respond.
Member states are free to set specific policy priorities. For instance, the development and maintenance of infrastructure. In fact, the EU has encouraged investment in infrastructure in Italy. The 2018 country-specific recommendations adopted by the Council called on the Italian authorities to better target investments to foster infrastructural development.
The EU allocated $2.8 billion to Italy between 2014 and 2020 for network infrastructure like roads and rail. In April, the Commission approved a $9.6 billion investment plan for motorways in Italy. The country spent more than $16 billion on roads in 2006, but that dropped to less than $3 billion by 2010. Italy is $2.5 trillion in debt. In Europe, that's second only to Greece. The Morandi is the 12th bridge or overpass to collapse in Italy since 2004, and the country will need to dig really deep to avoid another tragedy like this. Liz Maddock, TRT World.
So let's go to Rome next, and joining me from there is Giovanni Ferri. He's a professor of economics at LUMSA University. Giovanni, great to have you on the show. Italy's populist Deputy Prime Minister Matteo Salvini says this tragedy could have been avoided if it had been allowed to spend more on infrastructure. The EU fights back and says, well, they could have spent more. Who's right here?
Well, certainly they are both right, but it is true that Mr. Salvini has a point in stressing that if we spend more as a country that has problems with respecting the 3% deficit rule that is set forward by the Growth and Stability Pact, it's going to be problematic to spend in infrastructure. And there has been a discussion for years over the so-called golden rule, by which investment by the public administration could be exempted from the 3% rule.
Right. Now, the European Commission has said that it recently approved about $9.6 billion, that's 8.5 billion euros, in an investment plan for Italian motorways. Is that enough?
I think that is not enough, but it is moving in the right direction. If we look at the tragedy that hit Genoa, I mean the collapse of this bridge, which was going over one of the most populous cities in the country, certainly that is a red signal that something more needs to be done in terms of monitoring and repairing infrastructure to through the country, through the highway system. And that could cost up to 1–2% of GDP, which is clearly much higher. It could be in the range of 20–30 billion euros rather than 9 billion.
Right. Giovanni, let's just look at the local economy of Genoa for a moment. I mean, that highway and that bridge went through a very busy area, and it was a major artery for the local economy. What is the potential impact for the Genoese economy after this tragedy?
It's going to be a blast and a pain in the neck for the people from Genoa. As a matter of fact, I had two friends from Genoa who were my guests in the last few weeks, and they are very preoccupied about what is going to happen to city traffic, because that bridge was the fundamental infrastructure. There is only one other infrastructure that is linking west to the east. And for the people who have visited Genoa and the Liguria region, it is a mountainous region with only a small part close to the sea. So unless something is done very quickly, it's going to be a mess.
Right. Let's talk about infrastructure spending more broadly across the EU. I mean, last year, excuse me, the European Investment Bank warned that EU countries are spending too little on digital and transport infrastructure. In fact, it was at a 20-year low of about 2.7% of GDP. Which countries, when you look across the EU, are most vulnerable to faulty infrastructure like this?
Well, the countries that have been experiencing sovereign crisis and therefore they had to be much more watchful of their public expenditures are, that is, Greece, Spain, Italy, Portugal, are clearly the countries that have the most severe problems in terms of having cut back into infrastructure spending. So I guess that for the EU to step a little bit forward in that respect, these countries would need to have a special plan in order to ameliorate and avoid for the future anything like what happened in Genoa, which is clearly the result of malpractice, and we should really try to avoid these episodes to repeat.
Okay, Giovanni, this also raises another interesting and very crucial point. This road, this bridge was managed by a private company, Autostrada, which had a concession to manage and maintain this piece of infrastructure. Has this tragedy kind of inflicted something of a dent in that model of private companies being able to maintain such crucial infrastructure?
I think that there was a lot of enthusiasm about privatizations throughout the 1980s, and the highway company in Italy was privatized 20 years ago. But in order for privatizations to work in this type of dimension, you need to have a watchdog. And I believe that the watchdog was not really operating in this case. So we experienced in Italy that the tolls, the highway tolls, kept increasing much higher than inflation rates. And we now realize that probably there was no monitoring and no maintenance at the level that was expected from that.
Right. We will have to leave it there. Giovanni Ferri, economics professor at LUMSA University in Rome. Thank you very much indeed.